Everyone, and you are all very welcome to the second session in the new series of our Client Experience webinar program. We're delighted that you can be with us today. My name is Niamh O'Connor and I'm part of the Client Experience program team here at Dentons. As you know, our Client Experience webinar program continues to be focused on bringing you practical insights on some of the biggest challenges and opportunities facing you and your in-house legal team. Today's topic is very much at the top of corporate agendas, and over the next 90 minutes, we're going to deep dive into some of the key trends our panel believes that you and your in-house legal teams need to know about the procurement, deployment, and use of AI. But before we do that, we're keen to get your input and views on a recent survey our UK, Ireland and Middle East practices carried out. With lots of noise and headlines focused on AI, we commissioned a piece of research to better understand exactly where leaders of large international businesses are in their AI adoption journey. We surveyed 450 C-suite executives and general counsel. The report finds that while business leaders believe AI will transform their business, there is a significant gap between that AI ambition and action. And it explores closing that gap by gaining traction across a number of key areas. We would love everyone today to have an opportunity to input into this report. So with that in mind, we're going to carry out 4 polls right now that we would love your participation in. The report itself will be launched in early November. If you'd like a copy, drop us a note at cxprogram@dentons.com and we will automatically share the results and commentary from today's polls with you all in early November. So let's get started. Our first poll focuses on your internal AI roadmap. So let's see where you are on this. So the question we have for you is, does your organization have an AI strategy or roadmap for AI and technology? You might already have one in place. It might be in the process of being implemented, not yet, but you know that you really need to implement one. Or you may think, you know what, we don't think one is needed. So it's great to see everyone getting involved in this. We're going to give it just a few moments. I can see we're past 50% participation already and heading up. So let's just do a short countdown. So let's go 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I can still see lots of votes coming in. So let's just give it 2 more seconds. Excellent. Wow. So super participation on this one. I'm going to end the poll and share the results with you all. So interesting. So slightly different. We ran this session for another time zone earlier today. So we do have slightly different results. So 37% of you are in the process of implementing and 36% of you know you need one, but you've not yet had an opportunity to implement it. Okay, so let's go to poll 2. So poll 2 focuses on corporate agility. So the ability of your organization to respond to the opportunities presented by AI. So in thinking about a 3-year time horizon, which of the following approaches is your organization most likely to take to enhance its capabilities? Do you see your organization participating in M&A? Do you see the organization licensing AI? Do you see yourselves buying third-party AI solutions as a service? A minority stake and taking a minority stake in an AI organization? Do you see the organization building solutions and tools internally? Or maybe at this point you're not sure on the approach that's most likely to be taken. So I can see really high rates of participation. So thanks to everyone for jumping in on this straight off. We're just going to do a short count. So let's go 3, 2, 1. On this one, and we're just over 60% participation. I'm going to end the poll and share the results with you all. So this one actually is quite consistent to the group that we had earlier today. 44% of you see your organization buying third-party AI solutions as a service. Okay. So let's go to our third question for everybody. This particular question focuses on how AI will impact your workforce. So the first question is, how do you feel workforce productivity has changed since the start of your organization adopting AI tools? So again, it gives you a number of different ranges. Is it an increase or decrease of between 1 and 5, 6 and 10, or maybe it's above 10% you feel that productivity impact is? For anyone who is super enthusiastic on the polls, we have put in a bonus question for this particular one. So if you scroll down, you will get a bonus question here. We are curious as to the ultimate objective here for your organization. So are you primarily implementing AI to reduce overall headcount and outgoing costs, or to create an augmented workforce and boost growth through productivity gains? Excellent. So some interesting participation rates here. So everyone maybe not as certain on the numbers for the first question. So we have a slightly lower participation rate, but everybody pretty sure around the ultimate purpose when it comes to our second question. So let's stop in the poll and share the results with you all on this one. Okay. So we can see either no change, or we can see or no change or an increase between 1 and 5%. And when it comes to the purpose or intent behind AI from a workforce transformation perspective, we can see that it is to create an augmented workforce rather than reducing overall headcount. Okay, excellent. And our final poll, you will be glad to hear. Okay, so this poll looks at digital resilience and data management. So I know our panel are going to be interested in particular for the results of this one. So how mature do you feel the data management policies are within your organization today? And it maps the options across a range of unaware, aware, you feel they're reactive, proactive, managed, or effective. So keen to get your input and views as to your sense of where you sit on that scale when it comes to your data management policies. Excellent. Brilliant. And we can see lots of participation again. For our last one, I promise no more polls for the rest of the session, so we will give you a break after this one. So we're hitting towards 50%. Let's just go 3, 2, 1 on this one. And we do have quite a clear view emerging on this one, which will be for sure of interest. So let's end the poll and share the results with you all. Okay, so 31% of you feel or would rate your data management policies as proactive. Okay. So thank you all for jumping into that exercise with us. I'm really excited to get stuck into the session and hand you over to our fantastic panel today. I would encourage you to get involved, ask questions in the chat, and use the messaging functions, because we are really keen to continue to get your input as we move through the content of today's session. So without further ado, I'm delighted to hand you over to my colleague at Denton's, Antonis Patrikias, who will introduce you to our panel and take you through today's session. We hope you enjoy it.
Thank you very much, Niamh. Hi, everyone. It's Antonis Patrikias here, Privacy Cyber and AI partner based in London, England. I co-chair the firm's Global Privacy and Cyber Group, and I also lead the firm's Global TMT Sector Initiative. It is my pleasure to welcome you all in this session today. Our theme today is key trends in AI governance, procurement, and deployment for global organizations. And we're going to spend the next 80 minutes or so focusing on three things. Number one, we're going to do a quick global overview of the latest legal and regulatory developments. There is a lot happening around the world, and one of the key themes that we hear from our clients is what is going on, what laws are coming through, what do I need to know? So we'll do a quick tour of the world where my fellow panelists are going to cover the developments. And then we'll do a deeper dive into the meatier part of the session. So we're going to look at two separate, or three actually separate parts of the AI life cycle. We're going to focus first on procurement, and we're going to see what are the key issues that my expert colleagues see in practice, and what are the governance controls that we should put in place. And then we're also going to focus on deployment and use of AI, again, trying to bring out the key issues. The emphasis being on addressing the practical challenges and the key issues that we see emerging in practice. So if I can introduce my fellow colleagues, I'm very pleased that we have with us today a stellar lineup, literally from around the world. Let me start with Juanita Acosta, who is our partner in Colombia, in Bogota, and leads our LATAM privacy and AI practice. Unfortunately, because of a personal issue at the last minute, nothing too serious, thankfully, Juanita was unable to join us today. So I'll make a very basic effort to convey the key points that she made in this morning's session. A lot happening in LATAM. Then moving up north to Canada, Chantal Bernier, one of our experts in Canada and former federal privacy regulator of Canada, is going to tell us what is happening in Canada, in particular that small but really important territory called Quebec. Moving south, Todd Aubert from Washington, D.C., heads a US practice and is going to talk us through various developments in the United States. Moving across the pond to Europe, starting with the UK, my partner Dan Burged, based in London, one of our most experienced commercial technology lawyers, was going to try to demystify for us some of the aspects of AI procurement. Down to the European Union, and in particular Italy, Milan. Chiara Bocchi, a counsel in our privacy, cyber and AI team, and one of our lead lawyers in developing our AI capabilities and thought leadership, who works very closely, of course, with Giangiacomo Olivi, who's the co-chair of our European IP data and technology practice and leads our global AI working group. And last but not least, in the furthest part of the world, Australia, Robin Chatwood, who chairs our practice in the APAC region, is going to tell us about all the exciting things that are happening in that very wide and very diverse part of the world. And as we said, throughout this session, we're going to try to bring out the key themes and the key issues that really we need to be tackling when we're procuring, deploying, or using AI. There's not enough time to cover absolutely everything, but we'll try to focus on the key issues. As Neve said, we are really keen to hear from you, whether it is sharing experiences or asking questions. So please feel free to make use of the chat room, and Neve and I will try to pick up all the questions and then pass them on to our panelists to do the tricky bit, which is answering them. So if we can move to the next slide, please, Neve. Let's do a quick 20 minutes around the world in terms of AI legislative and regulatory developments. Robin, how about you kick us off with Australia and APAC?
Sure. Thanks, Antonis. So look, it's no surprises that, there's various approaches going on in APAC. So there's a combination between some guidance being produced in certain jurisdictions such as China, Singapore, India, Japan, and in Australia as well. We've got some voluntary guidelines, guardrails. And then there's actually some draft law that are before the parliaments and various regulatory bodies. That's Korea, Vietnam, Thailand, Philippines, and then Australia is also contemplating and has published for consultation some mandatory guardrails for AI. And then there's actually some current hard law in place in China, Indonesia, and Philippines. So just unpacking that specifically, in China, there's some cybersecurity AI guidance from 2023 for AI products. There's an AI law, basically making its way through the legislative process. And then there's various sectorial and municipal regulations and guidance. In Singapore, they were one of the first, out of the gate for an AI governance framework in Asia. And so it was voluntary, based on two fundamental principles about the decision-making process being explainable, transparent, and fair, and AI being human-centric. They've produced an AI Verify toolkit. India has created also some governance principles building on the OECD guidelines. They've got now 4 national committees to develop a policy framework. Japan has got some non-binding AI guidelines, and they've created an AI national strategy. And they've also got some contract guidelines for AI and data use, including model clauses. Korea has some draft acts before Parliament, so one promoting the AI industry and establishing trustworthy AI frameworks. That's going to be a mega law that consolidates about 7 related bills that have been introduced since 2022, and they involve things such as, advance notice being given to users for high-risk areas, and, certification requirements in some cases. And then we've got in other areas like Indonesia, there's AI is already regulated under the Electronic Information and Transactions Act. The government has also got 2 draft guidelines out around ethical values. New Zealand doesn't look like they're doing anything anytime soon. They've got a cabinet paper published in June that makes very clear that a standalone AI Act is not on the horizon. In Vietnam, we've got AI systems being classified according to risk, according to their draft law that was released in July. 2 draft laws in Thailand, and we've also got Data Privacy Act in the Philippines, which requires already data subject consent for decisions with legal effects concerning a data subject that are based solely on automated processing. And then we've got 3 draft bills at the moment making their way through. So lots going on in the APAC area.
Pretty clear, Robin. Thank you very much. And I guess with APAC, the challenge is it's such a vast and diverse region of the world, and you just described to us multiple layers of incoming or existing laws and regulations with slightly different approaches reflecting legal cultures and traditions. So already, I think, emerging here, even within a particular part of the world, the APAC region all being vast, a lot of diverse approaches and a lot of complexity. But over here in the European Union, we're quite good at harmonizing things. So if I may pass over to Cara, surely, Cara, the picture in Europe is less complex, right?
Less complex, well, depends the meaning that you give to less complex, maybe. Well, we have the AI Act, we have something that regulates AI, and well, here in Europe, at least here in Europe, we believe that the AI Act is the first ever comprehensive legal framework on AI and worldwide. The AI Act, we all know, it is a sort of product safety regulation. It aims to ensure that AI is safe, trustworthy at the time when it is put in the European market and for its whole life cycle. And it has a risk-based approach, meaning that the higher the risk, the stricter the requirements that apply to the different types and categories of AI systems. It has already entered into force. It entered into force on the 1st of August. It will be fully applicable 2 years later with some exceptions. Prohibitions will take effect after 6 months. Governance rules and the obligations for general purpose AI models will become applicable after 12 months. And the rules for AI systems that are embedded into regulated products will apply after 36 months. So we have the AI Act said, but the good news or the bad news is that we are not done. The AI Act is complex, but providers and deployers are not left alone. The European Commission has to develop no less than, we have an estimate, 30 guidelines, codes of practice, codes of conduct, etc., to cover various key aspects of the AI Act, such as obligations of general purpose AI models providers, technical documentations, the so-called FRIA, Fundamental Rights Impact Assessment. And today, works have already started with regards to the code of practice for general purpose AI models, including for those with systemic risks. And the code of practice will detail basically the rules of the AI Act for such categories of AI systems, aiming at facilitating the application of the rules of the AI Act for general purpose AI models, covering issues like transparency, copyright, risk assessment, mitigation measures also. And of course, providers should be able to rely on the code of practice to demonstrate compliance. And in this context, the AI Office is working as a facilitator to ensure that the code of practice is effectively able to address all the rules of the AI Act. And after the code of practice is, let's say, finally in draft, it will be assessed by the AI Office and the AI Board and published by the Commission, the Commission may also decide not to endorse the code of practice and issue different rules than the code of practice. And there is also more. We also have the AI Pact, which is a voluntary initiative that seeks to support the future implementation of the AI Act by supporting the voluntary commitment, voluntary pledges. They're also called that way to start applying the principle of the AI Act ahead of the full entry into force of the Act. And we already have more than 100 companies adhering to the pledges, to these voluntary commitments. And while one may also ask, why should my company adhere to the AI Act? Why should I start applying the AI Act before there is the concrete need, the concrete obligation to? Well, basically because adhering to the AI Act allows to work closely with the Commission. The participants are working with the Commission to build a common understanding of the objectives of the AI Act, to take concrete actions, to understand the AI Act and its concrete implications, and also to share knowledge. And well, the last initiatives that we can remind of now are also the AI Liability Directive and the new Product Liability Directive. Why? Because the AI Act, for being a product safety legislation, tries to prevent risks, whereas the AI Liability Directive and the new Product Liability Directive, which are still drafts, they will provide the rules and strategies to try to react to the risks that may have arisen regardless of the measures of the AI Act.
Thank you, Chiara. So not such a straightforward picture, right? So we've got the EU AI Act, but I think I heard you saying 30 codes of conduct. I'm not sure how many new offices, capabilities, regulators are being set up. No doubt developments will come out of the EU AI Pact initiative with all these companies trying to help the Commission figure it out. And you didn't even touch on the point that obviously in the EU, the AI framework is just part of the broader picture of regulation of technology and data, not just personal data. So really a very complex picture, and thank you very much for talking us through it. If we can move now to the United Kingdom, which, as we all know, is no longer part of the European Union. So we're taking our own approach. The slight complexity at the present time is we're not entirely sure what this approach is going to be. So as you may have heard, we had elections in this country in the summer. We have a new government. The previous government's plans have been basically scrapped. And thank you for going on mute. There was no mention of a specific AI bill in the current King's speech. So there's not going to be an AI law in the next 12 months, maybe later on. However, His Majesty's government has made it clear that there will be legislation on AI at some point. In the meantime, we are relying on regulatory guidance that it comes either from the data protection regulator, the UK Information Commissioner's Office, who's published some really helpful material and runs sandboxes and other helpful schemes, or sectoral regulators such as in relation financial services, the Financial Conduct Authority. Last but not least, the UK, like the US, is one of these countries that has an AI Safety Institute that focuses primarily on ensuring the safety of foundation models that are being used widely in the economy, and the AI Safety Institute will acquire statutory status moving forward. So please watch this space. The UK may be a relatively small jurisdiction, but it's a very important jurisdiction when it comes to the regulation of technology data and personal data. Why? Because it's the only country in the world that starts from the high standards of the EU, but then we're trying to make it more practical, more pro-innovation. And that says loads about the global approaches we can be taking. So please watch this space. And if we can move across the Atlantic, please, Niamh. I'm afraid it's me again, given that Juanita is not around. So I'll keep this very short and just try to convey the key points that Juanita made. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, very much like the other two regions that we just looked at, a lot is happening in Latin America too. There are regional initiatives such as the Ibero-American Data Protection Network recommendations. There are already some AI laws that are in place in countries like Peru and Uruguay. In Uruguay, it's an accountability instrument, but it has implications on artificial intelligence as well. And then, as you can see in the third bullet point, pretty much all the Latin America states are gradually introducing legislation. We also have recommendations or soft law instruments and different types of guidelines. Juanita made the following key points that I thought were extremely interesting. So first of all, historically, Latin American countries, or at least the bigger Latin American countries, tend to draw inspiration from what the EU does. So that tells us something about the direction of travel. Number two, broadly speaking, the approaches tend to be principle-based and risk-based approaches. So again, not dissimilar to the EU standards, drawing inspiration from the OECD principles. But also very interestingly, and that was the main point that caught my attention from what Juanita said in the morning, we also have judgments, including, as you can see at the bottom of the slide, recent declarations and findings, including a judgment of the Colombian Supreme Court that, among other things, suggested that it is possible that directors will have potential personal liability for failures to govern AI. So some pretty important developments in LATAM, and again, an emerging picture of complexity and diversity with a raft of new laws coming into play. So if we can now move north and see what our North American colleagues are doing in terms of regulation, how about we start with Canada, simply because I think it will be more fun if we finish with the US. Chantal.
Thank you, Antonis. So Canada has structural challenges to develop its strategic approach to artificial intelligence. The first one being that it has to align its regulatory framework with its two main trade partners, one being the US, the other one the European Union, and those trade partners are not going in the same direction. That's structural challenge number one. The second one is that Canada is a very decentralized state. Of all the federated states, it is the state where the members of the federation are most autonomous. The provinces in Canada are more autonomous in relation to the central government than, say, the Länder in Germany or the states in the United States, which curtails the jurisdiction of the federal government in many ways, including in relation to regulating on artificial intelligence. Nevertheless, the federal government has introduced in the House of Commons a bill to introduce an Artificial Intelligence and Data Act as part of its modernization of privacy law package. Is it inching its way through the House of Commons, facing several criticisms, mainly that it is really just a framework, just a shell. But there is a reason why. It is just a shell the federal government intended to leave it to regulation for the details, and that those regulations will be developed with consultations, hopefully bringing industry and civil society to the table. Because of this outrage, of the lack of precision, amendments have been put forward by the government since then, which at least put some definition around what are high impact systems, since the act is supposed to apply to those. And those 7 categories of high impact systems would really be all around individual impact. So for example, use of AI in employment is high impact. Use of AI in content moderation on the internet. Use of AI in health. So you see, where there is most impact on the individual is where the act would apply. The administration of the act would be put in the hands of a public servant, an AI and data commissioner, who would report to the Minister of Industry, Science and Economic Development. Also challenged, saying that that would not be a person who would be independent enough, to which the government replies, but this commissioner would have only jurisdiction over the private sector, not the public sector, and therefore would not find itself in a conflict of interest being embedded in a department. So this is where we're at in the provinces, the only province that has adopted legislation. So it is now in force. You've alluded to it a moment ago, and that is Quebec. Quebec has adopted a provision in its modernized privacy law that is akin to the GDPR on automated decision making, but goes further. Not only does it require organizations to be transparent about the use of automatic decision making, it also has to give the individuals the right to make representations on the use of their personal information in an automatic decision-making process. So this is where we're at in Canada right now.
Thank you, Chantal. Very helpful and very illuminating. And the thing with territories like Quebec, I mean, in conversations, Quebec law has been described to me as GDPR, but without the helpful parts. And the interesting thing with an observation like this is it's a relatively small market, but it's such an outlier when it comes to regulation that can potentially move the needle when it comes to global compliance programs. So really interesting stuff. But now turning to a very, very big market indeed, and a federal jurisdiction that surely takes consistent approaches when it comes to AI regulation. Todd, over to you.
Well,
yes, thank you. Yes, thank you. Like some of our other friends around the world, given our political structure in the US, there are different approaches to regulation of AI. And I think that the key thing to keep in mind for North America, at least for the United States, is there's a strong desire to lead in the development of responsible AI. So there's a lot of focus on creating the right type of atmosphere for AI to boom, not only for economic reasons, but also for strategic reasons. So there's a big focus on ensuring that there aren't, for the most part, regulations that stifle that innovation. One of the challenges with that is that the political dynamic in the United States, as I'm sure everybody's heard, is very divided at the moment, and it's very evenly split for the most part. So that makes it difficult, if not impossible, to move major legislation forward, at least at the federal level. So what you see happening is a lot more activity at the executive branch. So President Biden has adopted executive orders and has moved forward with directing agencies. So since the executive branch has power over agencies and has power to allocate funding that's been delegated to it or provided to it by Congress, they can really take and have a big impact. And so this particular administration has tried to work closely with industry, both within the US and around the world, to create these structures, frameworks, recommendations, and including financial support. You also see this coming into play through guidance provided by various different agencies, like the NIST guidance, which I would, if you're not familiar with the NIST guidance, it's really worth looking into. It's very helpful, very supportive to industry in helping people get their hands around what they need to be looking at. The Biden administration has adopted Executive Order 14110, and from that has led to a number of the initiatives, the PGIA, the GAIRA, the AI Global Development Playbook, the Bill of Rights, the Multinational Agreement, and various other initiatives. When it comes to legislation, there's actually bipartisan support at the federal level for several issues, but that doesn't mean that you'll be able to actually get them through Congress. Right now, the Republicans govern the House, although it's a very narrow majority and there's a lot of division within the Republican Party itself. And the Democrats have a very narrow lead in the Senate. With the presidential election, there's a lot of uncertainty, both as to who will get elected president, but also it looks like the Senate may go to the Republicans and the House may go to the Democrats. So the takeaway from this is it's not clear that anything major will move forward at the federal level, which is why I think you see so much action at the state levels. We have 45 different pending bills in various different states, and we have 31 already adopted in different states, including everything from major laws like in Colorado, which seemingly takes a more European approach and looks at high-risk areas and identifies a number of steps that must be taken when you have automated decision-making that can impact employment and other important issues. Although that law does not come into impact until 2026, and there's a lot of talk that may end up getting amended. You also have action at the local level. So a lot to consider for the US. And with that, I will turn it back over to Antonis.
Thank you, Todd. Interesting picture. And you know what, we complain sometimes about the EU, a big law and 30 codes of conduct, but it sounds like the picture that's emerging in the US is probably even more complex, where we might end up with 50 different laws and accompanying codes of conduct. And this is just part of the world, Neve. If we can very quickly click through the next slide, please. So there's other parts of the world that we just don't have time to cover. As you can see, there's some additional countries there. I can see there's a universal demand for the slides, and I think, Neve, we can give comfort to all our participants that they will receive copies of the slides. And then on top of national initiatives, we have what I like to call transnational soft law principles. I've even heard regulators complaining about the tsunami of laws, regulations, and standards that we currently have coming our way, and that creates a really complex picture. Now, granted, if you look at all these laws, we can identify common principles that can drive our approaches, things like transparency, explainability, robustness, reliability, human in the loop, and so on and so forth. But the picture remains very complex. So if that's the case, if the case is that despite all this complexity, legislative and regulatory initiatives, we can still distill principles that give us a way forward if we want to take a single consistent approach globally. The question then becomes, is there enough experience in the market already so we can start pointing to similarly common issues and common solutions that may apply in practice when we procure AI? And to help us answer this really interesting question, I will now turn to Dan and Jianji. So, gentlemen, what are you seeing in practice? Is AI procurement any different than any other technology procurement? What are some of the key issues that our clients should be aware of, and what are the governance controls they should seek to put in place? Dan, why don't you kick us off?
Thanks, Antonis. I think that it's fair to say that a lot of the problems we see in the procurement side of things, not necessarily driven by legislative priorities, although they do align in many respects, but the faces of many of those problems look very familiar, but they do, in the context of AI, seem to have been to the gym and got themselves on steroids, and are a lot bigger and scarier than they were in their former life. It's frequently said in relation to any form of IT procurement that it's important to have a vision for what you are truly trying to achieve with the procurement. And I think that's doubly true in relation to AI. I think that's partly because the AI hype cycle is obviously in full swing at the moment. Everything, but everything, is now cast as an AI solution, even when it's not. And I think that that's tended to obscure the fact that within AI, there is a phenomenal flexibility for it to be used in multiple different scenarios. And I think it's really when you come down to what those very specific use cases are, how it will function in those scenarios, is really going to drive whatever procurement issues you have from that. So, for example, if you are using a system on premises, trained only on your own data, and all of the queries are held internally to your system, it's going to look relatively safer compared to one that's been externally trained or combines external data, training data with internal training data. Avoiding personal data and all of this obviously again removes another risk factor. But just truly understanding what it is that people will need to use, and if I'm being fair, how it can be abused. If you're using a system to support your internal staff in their external facing view of the world, that's obviously an easier thing than having an AI system that feels free to contract with your customers, contract with your suppliers on terms of its choosing in moments of hallucination, and or open itself up for abuse as people try to get an incorrect result, and so on. So I think thinking very carefully about where it's used and where not, and ensuring that wherever possible, compatible with that vision, sensible safety precautions are taken to keep it all on track. But to say all of this comes down to what, for this specific implementation of AI, what is the outcome that's being done, or being sought. And where you get to that, I think it's also then possible to say, okay, so what do I need to give for that? Is it just handing over cash? Do I need to hand over my data? Am I compromising my cybersecurity by opening up a whole new channel and attack surface that I never used to have? So the trade-offs against that are inevitable from the design, but again, it starts from a clarity of what you're trying to understand. And I think that the thing that sort of walks hand in hand with that, from my perspective, which all sounds a little depressive, is that to be clear that about how what you are buying, because how you will get out of it. If you know you're buying a service from a service provider, you kind of understand that when it expires or you don't want to pay for it anymore, then you kind of walk away. But if you are basing your entire software stack is going to be based on this rapidly changing foundation, and you require significant upfront investment, you might want to know a little bit more about not how much evolution will happen in the next few years, but actually how much stability you can secure in relation to that. So whether it's holding APIs in a particular format, whether they're guaranteeing that you will be able to continue to interoperate, whether they're guaranteeing pricing for the next periods, in an industry which is committing incredible sums up front. The return on capital for all of those investments is utterly not clear. And sooner or later, one thinks that some of the suppliers will start to use this as to recognize that they actually need to start getting more cash through the door, or that they need to use it as driving other business benefits. So providers dragging you towards their other core solutions by using their AI offering to bring you towards their core offerings. I think all of those things kind of form part of a picture of it's very hard to generalize specifically across the patch in relation to this stuff. But I think for individual use cases, I think you can drive that vision through and be, if you're sort of super critical about it, recognizing the need to retain flexibility rather than being too specific about the specification of the solution. But if you recognize what that is, I think it really, really helps in terms of getting the contracting side of it right, the procurement side of it right, and then managing those projects on the way through. As people say, you get the behavior you tolerate in terms of contract management. And it is, I think, one of those areas where small differences that are allowed to evolve over time may well cause problems if that's allowed to happen. That all said, there is a phenomenal opportunity, I think, out there for certainly for people-heavy businesses to really realize some stunning transformation of their economic performance.
Thank you, Dan. Great opportunities, great challenges. Tianji.
Yeah, and I mean, as stated by Dan, you need to have a strategy. Okay, so and you need to allow some form of flexibility. But this strategy has to be in compliance with the authorities' expectations. So you would have to have your contract in line with the authorities' expectations. So how to do that? And you were asking, Antonius, whether there are any standards within the market. There are some standards, and actually the standard contracts we used to use are changing. How are they changing? Also based on the authorities' activities. This is easier on the data protection side, where we've seen a lot of gold plating by our authorities and a lot of, I would say, hyperactivity in certain instances. And actually, from the activities of the authorities, it is possible to gather some really good guidance, also in terms of, if you want to be practical, in terms of guidelines and checklists that can actually turn into contract clauses. So certain questions that have been made to the developers of AI services, for instance, the question that have been raised to OpenAI, can become actually clauses that can be applied, or strong rep and warranties that can be asked to with regards to the deployment of AI services. Just two examples, very recent examples, the European Data Protection Board list of questions that have been made to OpenAI, or which has been done on the 24th of May, or the following week, the checklist made by the European Data Protection Supervisor. Actually, they do provide a lot of insights and elements to be translated with all flexibility, of course, into a contract. Okay, so this is on the data protection side, if you want to have something practical, but how to follow the same path of having something practical outside also the data protection side. Obviously, from a European perspective, there will be standards. This is also one of the job of the AI office, to promote standards within the market. But in the meantime, there's one good example from the EU Commission, which starts from an old project of back in 2018 from the city of Amsterdam, which has been implemented and by the Procurement of AI Community, which is an initiative within the EU Commission. They've set a list of clauses that actually can be attached to contracts implementing for the implementation of AI technologies. And following Dan's path, the main element to follow, I've taken a list of 10 elements to note, but the main one is define the intended purpose for the usage of the technology, because the technology may be good or bad, but it's not the technology per se, it's the usage you make of it. And also, you want the supplier to adequately represent and warrant to you that that technology is good for the purpose you want to use it, and have clarity. Then it's fundamental having warranties on, there's a set of a risk management system, including a declaration that the residual risks are acceptable, then, and all the risks are identified and measures taken. Representations and warranty with regards to data set. We can talk about it for hours about labeling, annotation, and cleaning, enrichment, and aggregation, but we will do it in another webinar, hopefully. And technical documentation, which has to be succinct and understandable. You may also want to include to your supplier actually a cooperation to explain actually to the end users actually how the system works. Because there's a lot of talk about transparency, but how to implement that in practice is quite difficult. Then record keeping with regards to automatic logs, and actually having a level of traceability with the AI's functioning. And human oversight, we've talked about it before, also when we've done the round the globe tour. However, this globe, what does it mean in practical? You would have to have specific warranties that the oversight means also being able to say no, or to disregard the decision from the system. And by the way, the system does not generally decide, particularly with regards to LLM, but that's another point. Then obviously measures on data minimization, on robustness and cybersecurity, on actually the quality management system. So we'll talk about, and one good thing about the quality management system that we've seen is that sometimes there's a tendency to ask the policy that have been taken in terms of quality management. And this is actually good in order actually to learn from your suppliers, particularly those big suppliers residing in certain geographical areas. I'm not naming anyone. And then right to disclose information, and obviously audit. And the audit right is actually very important. The more audit you get, is sort of balance. It can be balanced with the strength of your rep and warranties. And obviously, the less you obtain, the more rep and warranties, the stronger you have to get. And actually, those will be attached to a system of termination. And but as long as you got a good contract, you don't have issues with regard to vendor lock-in. And in order to avoid vendor lock-in, you need really a lot in terms of explanation and what you're going to do once the contract is terminated. But, and most of all, who has the right to do what with the data set? This has to be addressed in the contract from inception. So there's actually a lot in terms of contracts are changing, but what has not been addressed by the European Commission is actually two other elements. One is relating to reputation. So it's often an issue of reputation with regards to suppliers within the AI industry, in consideration of the fact that some of these suppliers that are making use of AI systems are actually financed from agencies. So this is quite important. At the moment, everyone wants to go AI, but there will be a moment in which everyone will want to use a closer scrutiny. This is one point. The other point is actually insurance clauses that are getting more sophisticated in development, because when there's an issue, it's a very big issue. It's a mess with so this is really in a nutshell how actually also from a practical perspective, it is possible to implement that strategy that Dan was mentioning. I hope I stayed within the time, Antonis.
You were spot on. We have 4 minutes to go, and I might ask for some further input. Look, gentlemen, these are great insights. I mean, Dan, I kept hearing you, you know, it's about understanding what it is that you want to do, understand your real risk, understand what you're committing, what you're investing, what you're getting yourself into, and how you get out of it should you need to get out of it. And then, Giangi, turning to your point, as always, there are instruments or areas where we can draw inspiration, at least as far as the EU piece is concerned. And I loved your point, which was draw inspiration from those regulatory or EU Commission guidance pieces of guidance. Don't follow them slavishly, because as we know, our good friends in the EU have a tendency to be a bit overly prescriptive. And then, of course, you have reality kicking in. Of course, if it's a negotiation of a global project, global product between two major multinationals, there's a certain negotiating leverage. But for many clients in the market, basically, will they have the negotiating power to get the provisions that they want? I'm interested, team, anyone has any further thoughts on what we heard from Dan and Giangi? Robin, I can see you've unmuted yourself.
Yeah, I guess one point that comes up regularly is intellectual property. And so, you know, who owns what, you know, who owns the rights to inputs, outputs, and that sort of thing. So that's a battleground. I thought Giangi's point, you know, I totally agreed with what Dan and Giangi said. His point about vendor lock-in, I think, does lead to the point about exit strategy. You know, the technologies are, you know, improving all of the time, rapidly accelerating. The laws are rapidly proliferating and accelerating. And so you don't want to lock in possibly too long for one particular solution or vendor, because you want it to be responsive to other things, and also the price is coming down, so you need to have some sort of flexibility. And one of the issues that I find is that, you know, that there's this desire to use this contractual sledgehammers to crack a walnut, really, and so you get these protracted negotiations that might go nowhere. And I really think that, you know, some of the friction that you get between vendors and procurers, you know, on specific things, maybe if a little bit of transparency could reduce that friction, you know, so getting better details on the specific AI features, the purposes, the nature of the training data, whether the input data retrains the system, the output data, the level of human oversight, all of that kind of thing. If we can increase the transparency up front, you know, those measures, and get some commitments around those transparencies, that will help your procurement negotiation.
Thank you, Robin. And running out of time for this session, but I think one of our colleagues, Liane, has asked a question in the chat room, which goes precisely to the point. You know, if our survey is correct, that I think it added something like 60 to 65% of organizations, deployers are going to either procure AI or license AI from a third party. And as far as the big offerings out there are concerned, it's like 3 or 4 or 5 players, isn't it? What negotiating leverage would most companies have to actually get providers to move, and what are the standard terms? Now, obviously, this is not going to be a session commenting on any particular provider standards terms, but I guess if anyone in the group has any insights to share on this point, is this any different than cloud, for example? Is the reality that for most organizations, you will not really get big players to move, or is it a more nuanced picture?
If I may say, but Dan, please chime in. What we will see is actually would be pretty similar to what we've seen with regards to cloud. So with certain schedules, so certain specifics that will be applied to a certain sector, like for instance, the financial services. In this, what will help to make certain big operators more lenient is actually what the authorities have been doing. So there's quite actually certain active authorities now looking more into the antitrust side, because obviously by definition, the business model, the AI business model, also leads to more concentration in certain instances. And however, what we have seen is that there is scope, particularly at that time in which we are defining the standards, there has been the opportunity to negotiate, but that will lead to specific schedules related to specific sectors, because obviously that this is what we've seen with regards to cloud, and it's quite likely. I don't know if it's the same view for Dan.
Yes, I think that broadly follows. I think the distinction I draw, I suspect, is, you know, are you effectively buying a product? Because if it's a product service, you know, storage on a cloud, or a specific thing for Copilot or whatever else it may be, if it's a product-based thing, likelihood is they can't keep a standardized product and agree diverse terms around the things. There's obviously, you know, we're not talking here about pricing or whatever, where bulk discounts might be available, but the fundamentals of the thing, they have to keep everyone on the same page. But where you're talking about, you know, as it were, integration services, customization services, or building your own, those service providers will have far greater flexibility as to what they do. I think that the thing, going back to the product side of the thing, I think that, you know, Jen makes an excellent point in relation to, you know, legal compliance. I think the interesting thing will be effectively those companies who want to stay in the market with a product understand that they have to offer a legally friendly product for their customers to use, because people who find themselves, you know, if use of Copilot or whatever actually was fundamentally illegal you know, would cause legal problems across the patch, then it becomes less attractive as a marketplace. I think that is going to come down to, again, to specific use cases, but I think there is a sort of general move that those big providers will follow the law and particularly have an eye on antitrust, as GNG says, even though they have the right in many cases to unilaterally change their terms as they go along. But the thing that keeps them to control is the fact that those big players are, you know, at least have an eye out for what problems they might get themselves into.
Thank you very much, Tim. This is really interesting stuff. I mean, we could be talking about this for another hour or what have you. I've been taking notes like crazy, and actually I've had the privilege of hearing you in another session this morning. So I hope that our clients are finding this equally helpful. We're a couple of minutes behind schedule, so let's move on to the next area, deployment and use, right? So we've done our due diligence, perfect due diligence. We checked everything. We succeeded in getting all the terms in, so we're 100% compliant and shiny, and it's all perfect. But now we actually have to roll it out within the organization, and our people are going to start using it. So what are the key issues at this stage? What are the key issues during deployment and use that we typically encounter? And again, what key governance steps should our clients be putting in place? So Todd and Robin, maybe I pass to you for that part of the conversation. Let us know what you think, please.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you very much. This has been a great conversation. And I think that as you get to the deployment and use of the AI tools, I think what you really need to do is you need to have a realistic view of the actual risks and opportunities that you face. So I think there's a tendency sometimes that once technologies have been procured to view it as a compliance issue. And I think that particularly here, that's a mistake. Obviously, compliance is important, but I think that you're much better off if you take a pragmatic approach to identifying risk and addressing the risks that you have for your particular organization than you do just viewing a list of requirements of the law and checking them off like a box, which is one of the reasons why one size does not fit all when it comes to the policies and the approach to deploying and using artificial intelligence. And so if you do that, in order to do that successfully, you need to have input from various different ranges within your organization, because you're not going to be able to do this from the legal department alone. You really need the input from all of your people who are using it in a collaborative way, because the last thing you want to be doing is chasing after groups like the police, because what you'll find is that you'll never keep up and people will find ways to evade you. So if you can set up the structure where you're collaborating, actually listening, actually identifying where you might even need a third party who understands the technology better if that's not in your capability set, to bring that in. But to get to this good spot and you start looking at actual risk, I think that what we've seen is there's sort of two buckets of risk that many organizations face. One is I would consider to be risks that are sort of external to the technology. So in other words, you know, as Dan and Gianji told us, that you need to make sure you understand what you're buying and make sure it's appropriate for what you need. Well, this technology is changing so much over time. There's a possibility that the technology could change in ways that aren't as appropriate or aligned, or that the training, the data sets might be morphing over time. So you need to have a way to sort of look to the outside to make sure that the tool, the technology that you've either developed or purchased is continuing to meet your needs in the way that you intended. But I think equally as important is this other bucket of risk, which is internally. So are your teams, if you've decided that you needed to acquire a screwdriver, are your teams continuing to use your technology as a screwdriver should be used? Or are some people starting to use it for other purposes where a hammer might be a better fit? So you need to find ways to make sure that you're not getting scope creep or use creep over time, so that outcomes that might be appropriate for one purpose might not be appropriate for another. And then also looking at the same issues of training for data sets, looking for outcomes, making sure that the outcomes are accurate. And I think that there's no substitute for that than to have humans involved in the process who actually understand the technology, understand the dangers of bias of, some of these models, depending on the type of artificial intelligence involved, can have problems over time as they start circling in their analysis. So I think that these are all really important. And then finally, what I would say is, even if you're doing all the right things, it's also important that you document what you're doing. And I don't just mean documenting your approach. I mean documenting your decisions along the way. If you look at guidance like from NIST, what they say is you look at your risks, you look at your resources, and you allocate your internal resources in accordance with the magnitude of the risk, which means by definition that some risks are going to get less resources than others. And what we've seen in the past is that even if you're doing everything correctly and you've mitigated the bigger risk, you could have a smaller risk, something arise out of that. And I think that as you face litigants or regulators, they tend to have this hindsight is 2020 vision, that they say, well, you had this incident, obviously you weren't doing this correctly. You could have two outcomes from that. You could have parties who did exactly the same thing, arguably exactly the right thing. One party has documented everything and has a good basis for that conversation with the regulator, or a good defense against the litigants. versus another party who did exactly the same thing but didn't write it down, you'll find that the litigants and the regulators have a tendency to say, well, what you're telling me is just a post hoc rationalization. So I think that it's really important to get into that good functioning methodology of coming up with a good plan that actually is appropriate for your organizations, not just in theory, and then following it and recording it in a collaborative way that isn't a mini regulator within your entity. And with that, I'll turn it over to Robin.
Thank you. I guess just focusing on what we mean by deployment, we're really in a phase where we're talking about we're moving out of a test environment into a production environment. So, theoretically, the model's been developed, it's meeting the expected outcome, it's performing at a level that's determined now that it's ready for use on live data, and we're now deploying it into a production environment. So in this case, that means the model is about to take in new data that wasn't part of any training cycle. And so integrating these AI models into existing enterprise systems, that can be a complex undertaking, just like with any technology, procurement and deployment. And, with most technology solutions that are being deployed, there's still really a gap between, the developed algorithms and then really the number of successful deployments. And so you need careful consideration of a whole range of factors to really ensure there's that seamless communication between the model and the existing infrastructure. And problems can arise at all sorts of stages of deployment. They can, before the model's developed, it could be the issue of unclear problem definition. That's sometimes a barrier to successful deployment itself. But, in the model development, the training data can be biased, as Todd touched on. When you're transitioning to production data, there can be a real drop in model performance. It can actually, perform worse in a production environment than it ever performed in the test environment. That can result from changes to, data formats, timing, the context. Context is crucial. And so basically, if you're making it now past the deployment phase, then getting that end user engagement is really a crucial facilitator. And it can be a barrier if you don't get it to a successful uptake. How often have we seen deployments where nobody wants to use it because their initial, view of it was that this is a lousy system. And so really making sure that the end users are correctly using that deployed product is really difficult if there's no buy-in or trust of the system. And so you need, basically a flexible approach, a modular approach, where you can scale up, you can allow for flexibility. And then, the context is now that your AI deployment is actually going to be, it's learning from every single interaction. And so you've got to be looking at, have you got the governance structures in place in a deployment phase, to be monitoring data quality, to be monitoring, as Todd touched on, the model drift. You get this sort of scope creep, where we're now using it for different uses than it was ever contemplated. Bias, if it was trained on biased, in a biased way, with assumptions built in a biased way, maybe that will also get worse over time. So, you've got to be out there frequently auditing your models for bias, putting in mitigation mechanisms in place, and that sort of thing. So, no different from, other sort of deployments of technology, robust access control mechanisms, robust monitoring systems, regular audits and things like that in place. So, just to validate those data sets and, consider really, have you got the ability in that governance structure to actually update, patch regularly, having a look at your security around that, you're conducting your penetration testing, your audits. And then maybe you need a different governance structure in a deployment environment than you needed in a procurement environment or a use environment. So, they're some of the considerations, that I think need to be taken into account.
Yeah, and thank you very much, Todd and Robin. Some really good nuggets and practical recommendations there. I mean, if I can just start with the last point you made, Robin, effectively we're saying, well, you essentially need different governance depending on the state of procurement or deployment that you are. Same principles, but different controls for procurement, for deployment, for use. Common themes, common principles, like testing, monitoring, ongoing monitoring. We're in this world now where we need to be monitoring how the tech works all the time, but also things like human in the loop, or Todd said, bring in someone who understands the technology. Now, here's my slight challenge, and I can see we also have a couple of questions in the chat room that I'll raise shortly and we'll bring in the rest of the team. But that's where reality kicks in sometimes, right? Because not every organization has a person who understands this technology and can make it happen. And I guess that's part of our job, whether we're in-house or external advisors, as AI governance and data privacy advisors, to try to make it work through the imperfection and make sure that we achieve the business objective while mitigating to the extent possible the risk. That's where the magic is, in my opinion. We know where we're heading, but reality kicks in, and then we just have to adapt and mitigate the risk. So I can see we have a clear request from Leanne. Thank you very much for the request to have a dedicated session on negotiating AI contracts. I'm sure we'll be happy to oblige, whilst also taking a balanced approach between customers and suppliers, because there are two perspectives to this one. So Leanne will definitely be having more sessions on AI around the year, and your recommendation has been duly noted. Thank you very much. We also have a question from Behrang, which is an interesting example, actually, right? So you're using technology that's not AI, and then the supplier starts providing AI features around that technology, but yet there's no specific terms and conditions that apply to that AI aspect of a non-AI product. So if I may bring in the rest of the team here, what would be our recommendation to Behrang? How do you deal with this? Anyone?
Well, I would say, and I'm sure that Dan, Gianji, Robin, Chantal, and others can weigh in. If you're taking that pragmatic approach to risk, right, the label that gets placed on the technology should be less important than the actual performance of the technology you've procured. So in other words, as you go through that procurement and use process, if you see things drifting, or you see things that are inconsistent with the risk profile that you've negotiated, you can raise it with the provider of the technology and ask, why is this happening? This doesn't appear to be consistent with what we procured. This seems to be introducing additional risk, and either get that to stop or make an amendment to your agreement. And I think that that gets to another point. I think what's so critical when it comes to AI is overhyped at the moment, in my opinion. And I think that it's really important to see through it. The laws of physics continue to apply. And if you hear people talking about something and you don't seem to understand it, that doesn't mean that you're wrong. Or you can bring somebody else in to help get a true understanding of what you're dealing with. I saw
Thank you, Todd. Gianji, either you were waving goodbye or you want to say something. Please unmute.
No, I was hoping actually did recognize the hand gestures, but it doesn't work for some reasons. But just very quickly, the clauses I've been mentioning before, the one for the European Commission initiative, actually, the same European Commission said, do apply these also for other technologies whenever possible. Likewise, the GDPR is technology neutral. So in principle, it applies with all technologies. So we need to be in a mindset also when we look at these contracts, even though we look at AI, also to ensure that actually there's some level of flexibility, as Dan was saying. But actually, it introduces another important point that brings me back to the good old times of the beginning of the open source, where everyone was saying, well, I'm not using open source. Okay, then you would make a check with the crawl, and then you would realize actually basically most companies were using open source. And initially it was being perceived as something with a certain level of risk, of higher risk. Meanwhile, it's just a matter of being able to manage the open source. So what's actually the end of this long or short, whatever you see story, is that you would need to factor in when you do your technology contracts that there may be always some AI being used also by your suppliers, because actually they use this technology more than what they think about it. Actually they do know. So you need to have some cautions and some protection in there. At the same time, with the contract, whenever you deal with technology, the contract evolves. So you need to be able also to how to address these technology changes. But obviously, if they tell you they are not using AI and they use AI, I'm sure I would expect you also have some strong contractual protection. Thanks.
Thank you, Gianji. And also I think this also touches a little bit, if I understand your question correctly, Behram, there's the contractual piece, but there's also the kind of shadow AI dimension here. So parts of the business are using AI and don't even know about it. How do we deal with that? Any thoughts on this point from anyone in the team? Robin?
Yeah, I just want to make a point. I was going to make the shadow AI point as well, which is, you know, we we were talking about this earlier, is that not only are you having certain situations where people are using AI and you don't even know what AI is being used in your organization, but you're also getting the flip side where people are claiming things are AI and it's not actually AI that's being deployed at all, but they just wanted to put the sexy title on it. So you're getting both of those. The point I was going to make, in response to what something Todd said about documentation is probably around, there's other reasons, often commercial reasons, why you want to document things. Many of our clients are relying on particular certifications like ISO standard certifications, or, the people they're doing business with are contractually obliging them to maintain certain certifications, so they've got to document those to be able to evidence that they're complying with them and that, they're controlling, particular risks and things like that. So there could be multiple reasons why you definitely want to be tidy on a documentation front, not just because a regulator or a litigator is going to come knocking.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Robin. We're surprisingly bang on time, so let me abuse this a little bit. Chiara, Chantal, any further thoughts on what we just discussed? I think the team made some very good points around key governance controls and some interesting observations. But any additional thoughts from you?
So as I was listening to Dan and to Gianji, I felt that their presentation underscored the importance of starting with issue definition. AI is so new, it has impacts that we don't necessarily think of. So the first step is to really define all of the legal implications. So for example, recently we were talking about an AI solution on a medical solution, meaning the patient and physician's conversation is taped and the AI doesn't just transcribe it, it actually produces a medical diagnosis. And you can think of a lot of things, but that was it. That was what we needed to do. We needed to identify what were all the legal implications on that. So that's really the first step. Then once you have defined them, algorithmic impact assessments are also an excellent discipline to assess, do we really follow data minimization, or are we building a solution on excessive amounts of data? Or is the processing of the data subject to consent? Or is it a consistent use and therefore we don't need new consent, but we need transparency? So the algorithmic impact assessment is also great discipline, and the privacy impact assessment is also great discipline. And I'll just add to finish, talking again about the Quebec Act, because it comes with heavy fines. That's what gives it its bite. Every adoption of new technology predicated upon the use of personal information in Quebec is now subject mandatory privacy impact assessment. So that's the first thing. And secondly, if the AI use is also linked to biometrics, it is subject to a mandatory declaration to the regulator. If that AI use leads to a data bank of biometrics, in fact, it has to be declared 60 days before being put into force, and the regulator could even express recommendations or objections. So there's also a governance framework that is becoming regulated in Canada.
Thank you very much, Chantal. Chiara, may I pass to you? Anything to add? I mean, all our colleagues listed so many recommendations. Is there anything else that you would add?
I took some notes while Robin was discussing the deployer side of the EA world, and in particular, she highlighted that understanding or non-understanding technology could be an issue. This is something that the AI Act wants to address by making it mandatory to provide AI literacy to the personnel and to everyone involved in the AI life cycle. And she also mentioned the need of flexibility, the need of let's say, try to prevent and fight against biases, also using data. And it will be interesting in Europe, of course, at least as far as it is my market, but everywhere, to see whether data protection authorities will be flexible and will understand, or whether they will be able to find a balance between data protection and the need to, as I feed AI with data to prevent biases, to protect other, let's say, rights and needs.
I'm smiling, Chiara. I'm smiling because I'm just trying to think what are the chances that our good friends, the EU regulators, will not disappoint us in finding this balance. It's a very difficult task, and I have to say, I've been impressed by what some European regulators are doing in the field of AI, at least in this early stage. I'm looking at the UK Information Commissioner's Office, or the CNIL in France, or I would even say the Garante in Italy, Giangi and Chiara, if you'll agree. So far, it all seems to be practical advisory. Let us help you figure out how you do it. But at some point, the stick will come out as well. And when I was hearing Chantal talking about even Quebec has a percentage of worldwide turnover, fine, you can see how this risk of a global solution that is non-compliant potentially attracts very significant risk if you start adding up the different fines that you may incur in different parts of the world. I think this was very useful. We are almost running out of time. We still have 5 or 6 minutes for questions. So please feel free to share them in the chat room if there's any additional questions. I just want to briefly summarize what we heard the team now saying. So a lot of emphasis on the data side. Of course, everything else is also important, but data entails a lot of risk, and it's what may cause the AI to malfunction, and we go into training. I heard a lot about the need to have appropriately skilled people who bring in the right perspectives, but then again, just not enough people in most companies to do these things. So some interesting challenges there, and of course that links directly to the human in the loop requirement. Todd, I love your recommendation about documentation and accountability, and I know from all the work that you're doing that you're always very careful about what should be documented and how, for obvious reasons. And this is not a requirement that's come directly from EU law, if I'm understanding correctly. So here we have one of these emerging transnational principles, accountability, documented because it would be easier for you to explain or go back if you need to pull a product out and revert to the previous model, and you'd have been able to explain your approaches. So some really interesting points there. If there are any further questions from our participants, I will relay them. Otherwise, perhaps, there we go, a copyright question. So I'll be very glad to pass this to someone else. How do we manage copyright issues and consent from data owners? In practice, are data providers putting restrictions on data usage in AI models? A question from Priya, and it sounds like a tricky question. So who wants to have a go at this?
I'm happy to have a chat about that. I think, obviously what's in a contract is going to be, a risk allocation. And, one of the great uncertainties and, one of the things that's creating lawsuits around the world is, what's the AI being trained on, who owns it, and where's it going, and, the use that you're using it for, and whether that's copyright infringing or not. And so I think we're going to see a lot more activity in this area. And that could be a reason why when you are negotiating your procurement, maybe you don't want to own things. Maybe you actually want to take a different risk position from maybe something that intuitively you've really fought to get originally. And so I do think it's a frontier. It's a risk allocation and it's a negotiation point. And I think that, I see that the current litigation that you're seeing around the world is probably a failure of copyright law in the first place, a failure of, effective laws keeping up with technology or effective enforcement of copyright. And so that's why we're seeing that as a frontier.
Although, Robin, I'm sure it's fair to say it's only natural that the law falls behind technological developments, especially transformational inflection points like the one we're going through now. I guess the question is, what will be the market practice that will form over time? A question for Chantal Bernier in particular. Chantal, do you think Canadian regulators, in particular the Privacy Commissioner, will be investigating companies that require customers to opt out of use of their data for generative AI improvements? And that's again another question from Leanne.
So you can see already that the Office of the Privacy Commissioner Canada has a keen interest in artificial intelligence. They have produced consultations, recommendations on the law. So clearly they have that top of their list. Secondly, they have the right to initiate investigations upon their own discretion if they feel that there is a contravention of the act. So I think that looking at the questions that they ask our clients, I believe that they could very well choose to investigate where they see, for example, a misuse of personal data in AI, where they see a use of personal data in AI that is significant and yet hasn't been put through any privacy impact assessment. It's clearly on their radar list.
Thank you, Chantal. We have a couple of minutes to go. I want to pick up, it's not really a question, it's more of an observation from Bechrang, and I don't want to address his proposed approach to governance. It's in the chat room so everyone can see it, but it's a very simple observation he makes, which I totally agree with, and I think it's a very interesting one. Especially, he says, because everything will be AI in the near future. So to the older among us, this is a bit reminiscent of, remember the e-commerce revolution where you had banking and e-banking and commerce and e-commerce, and now it's all one and the same thing. What do you think, Tim? Is that a valid observation that Bechrang is making, that everything will be AI in a few years' time? And what does that tell us in terms of thinking strategically about this new technology? With 1 minute to go. Gianji.
A lot will be AI. I hope not everything. One issue is that most of the data will be AI generated. That is going to be an issue and the challenge in terms of then of the quality of the output, because it will be synthetic data feeding actually the systems that then will end up generating other data. So that's going to be the real challenge. I hope not everything will be AI.
Thank you. If we had a bit more time, I would pass to Todd to tell us why he thinks AI is neither artificial nor intelligent, but that's for another time. We're running out of time. Thank you everyone for attending. Niamh, over to you to wrap us up.
For sure, Antonis, I want to say a huge thank you to all of you for spending the last 90 minutes with us, really getting stuck into AI from lots of different angles. We would really love to hear what you thought of today's session. Pop us a note in the chat as you're leaving the session, and that would be really valuable to us. Thank you in particular for getting involved, for jumping into the chat, into the polls. We definitely put you through your paces at the start of the session, so a huge thanks to everyone for getting involved in today's session. I want to say an absolutely huge thank you to the panel today. They have been with us day and night across different time zones to make this session work for all of our clients. I wanted to thank them for taking us around the world in about 20 minutes and really giving us an amazing sense of AI across the world. And I also wanted to thank them for the time, thought and consideration they put into today's discussion. We hope you found it useful, practical and insightful. That is the core purpose of the programme. We have lots of great sessions coming up over the coming months, so we are very much looking forward to seeing you back online with us again. That concludes our session for today, so nothing else for me to say, just to wish you a great rest of the day, and thank you for being with us.